which sort of leads into what I wanted to cover in terms of the, of the sermon today. Because back in Hebrews chapter 11, Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 13, we read of individuals who've been recounted here in Hebrews 11, Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And we're told in verse 13 of Hebrews 11, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They were strangers and pilgrims. This wasn't their age, their time, their society. This wasn't where they had their roots. They were strangers and pilgrims. The word stranger means basically a foreigner. Their citizenship wasn't here. They were foreigners. They were pilgrims. They were passing through. They were in transit. And that is what we have to understand very deeply as we go through and we look here, because when we understand this verse, when we understand what's involved, what we're looking at is something that regulates our relationship with the world around us. It establishes the relationship that we have with this world, with this society, and is the basis by which we can interact and do the things that we that we do. Now, they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. If we come on over to 1 Peter chapter 2, not only were Abraham and Isaac and Jacob strangers and pilgrims, so also are we to be strangers and pilgrims. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, he writes, dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, which pull you down, which war against your mind, your inner being. Strangers and pilgrims, foreigners, temporary dwellers. You see, that is the relationship that the people of God in ancient times had with the world. That is the relationship that you and I are called upon to have with this world, this society, that we're to keep in mind that we are strangers. We're pilgrims. Now, this was something, as we just look through here, let's notice a couple of examples. See, God told Moses back in Exodus chapter 6, Exodus chapter 6 and verse 1, the Lord said unto Moses, now shall you see what I'll do to Pharaoh. With a strong hand shall he let them go. With a strong hand shall he drive them out of his land. And God spoke to Moses. He said, I am the Eternal. I appeared unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by the name of God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh was I not known. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers. The land where they traveled through, the land of their pilgrimage. The land where they were travelers and where they were foreigners. They were to receive it for an inheritance. They were going to inherit it. But when they were there, they weren't inheritors. They were heirs. They were strangers. They were pilgrims. David writes in the 39th Psalm, verse 12, he says, hear my prayer, O Eternal, give ear unto my cry, hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, and a sojourner, a pilgrim, as all my fathers were. I'm a foreigner and a pilgrim. David was king in Israel, but spiritually, he recognized that he was a stranger and a pilgrim. This was not where his roots were. On back a little further in the book of Psalms, Psalm 105. Psalm 105 and verse 12. Well, notice pick it up in verse 9, the covenant that God made with Abraham and his oath unto Isaac. He confirmed the same unto Jacob for a law, to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying, Unto you will I give the land of Canaan, the lot of your inheritance. When did he do that? When they were but a few men in number, yes, very few, and strangers in it. There were foreigners there. And even when they were foreigners, God promised the time would come when they would be no longer foreigners. The time would come when they would be possessors, when they would be citizens. But they were foreigners in the land. On over in Psalm 119. Psalm 119, verse 19. Psalmist writes, I'm a stranger in the earth. I'm a foreigner. Hide not your commandments from me. On down in verse 54, your statutes have been my songs in the house of my pilgrimage, my sojourning, my temporary dwelling. Over and over we see that the patriarchs of old were strangers and pilgrims. That we today as God's people, Peter tells us to abstain from fleshly lusts as strangers and pilgrims, foreigners and sojourners. We find over and over we've looked at just a few of the admonitions that's our status. Now let's go back and let's understand a little more specifically as to how it applies and how that should apply in our lives. Because I want to step back and to examine the lives of some of God's people. Particularly, we will look at a contrast between Abraham and his nephew Lot. And we can also look at the story of Jacob, Abraham's grandson. And we can look at the at the extent to which each of these individuals understood that they were strangers and they were pilgrims. What we find is that when we lose sight of our status, there are problems that result. When we retain a conscious awareness of that status, then there are some very positive things that occur. We pick up the story of Abraham back in Genesis 11 and Genesis 12. We find that Abraham, or Abram as he was at that time, was born in Ur of the Chaldees, which was a neighboring place to Babylon. It was in the area, the kingdom of Babylon. And we find that Abram and his father and several of his family members left and journeyed up the Euphrates to Haran. And that his father died there in Haran. And in chapter 12, verse 1, the Eternal said unto Abram, Get you out of your country, and from your kindred, and from your father's house, unto a land that I will show you. And I'll make of you a great nation. And I'll bless you and make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. I'll bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you, and in you shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So God told him, Go to a land that I will show you. Go to a land where you will be a foreigner. Well, we find that he went forth in the end of verse 5, he came into the land of Canaan. In verse 6, we find that he passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. Now here, Abram shows up down here where God told him to go. He says, come on, I want you to leave, go to a place that I'll show you, a land that I will afterward give you for an inheritance. He comes, he arrives, he's there. And of course he gets there and somebody else is already there. The Canaanite is then in the land. Now you can maybe imagine, he gets there and he sort of looks around and he says, now wait a minute. I know this is mine and you know this is mine, but who's going to break the news to them? Say, who's going to serve the eviction notice? These were not a real meek and timid people. They were pretty fierce and warlike. It's not always real safe projects show up and start serving evictions on people. And this was a bunch that he sure didn't want to have to do this with. So he was there, he was in a land, and he was a foreigner. He wasn't a part of that society. He wasn't a part of that culture. He was there in a strange land. And God said in verse 7, unto your seed will I give this land. Abram believed him, and he built an altar. And he left there, and he went to a mountain east of Bethel and pitched his tent. Bethel was to his west and Ai was on the east, and he built an altar, and then he journeyed on south and went on down to Egypt and then came back up in chapter 13 verse 1, and his nephew Lot was with him. And we find in chapter 13 verse 2 that Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and gold, and he went on his journeys from the south. He came back to Bethel, where he had pitched his tent earlier, between Bethel and Ai, unto the place of the altar. And Lot was there. And there began to be trouble between the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abram, because this area, once they settled and were there for a little while, the amount of cattle and sheep that they had overtaxed the grazing and the water that was available. And there began to be some trouble and a little strife among the herdsmen, and Abraham got word of it. So we're told in verse 8 that Abram called Lot, his nephew, and he said, look, I don't want there to be strife. I don't want there to be any problem between us. Now the whole land is here. It's, God has promised us this whole land, the land of Canaan. Now we're here, and if you look, this area that he's describing between Bethel and Ai, it's almost the center point. It's just a little ways north of Jerusalem. And you have all of about half of the promised land lay to the north and about half lay to the south. So what Abram did was he told Lot, he said, look, the whole place is here. You go one way and I'll go the other, and we won't be in each other's way. Now, Abram had evidently been doing some figuring. You ever try to second guess God? You try to figure out how God's going to do something. We come up with our scenarios, our ideas. Now, God had told him, he said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless and multiply your descendants. And to your seed will I give this land. Well, now Lot had come with him. Lot was his brother's son. His brother had died, and so he had taken Lot as though he were his own son. So Lot was related to him by blood. He was his nephew, his brother's son. And he had raised Lot up. So he had been turning it over in his mind, trying to figure out, here he is, he's 75 when he leaves. And, you're 75 and been married for years and years and you don't have any kids. The odds are sort of unlikely that you're going to have any. At least that's what most people would figure, and that's certainly what he figured. So evidently he'd sort of assumed that, well, I guess the way God's going to do that is he's going to bless me through Lot. Because Lot is like a son to me, and he's my brother's son. His father was my brother. His grandfather was my father, so we're part of the same family. So he thought, well, look, we're here in the land together, and eventually Lot will inherit. So, Lot, you just pick whatever part you want, and I'll take the other part. Well, Lot, we're told in verse 10, lifted up his eyes, and he beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I'll tell you something. If you really want to wreck some grazing land, just rain down fire and brimstone on it for a little while. This was a beautiful area before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. You go over there now and you're looking at the Dead Sea, and you're looking at some pretty desolate area. But it didn't used to look like that before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. But if you look at a map, that's not in the Promised Land. That is across the Jordan. You see, Abraham offered Lot. He said, Lot, what part of the Promised Land do you want? Lot looked over there and he says, actually, don't want to hurt your feelings, but, I sort of like that part over there. I like it over across the river. That looks like a really nice spot. I think I'll take my stuff. And we'll just let you and the Canaanites have this land. I'm going to cross the river and go over there near Sodom and Gomorrah. That's really pretty land. So we're told in verse 11, he chose him all the plain of Jordan. And he journeyed east. He crossed the river and went back over on the other side of the Jordan River. And they separated themselves one from the other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan. That was the land God told him to go to. And Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and he pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. They weren't just your ordinary average run-of-the-mill sinner. They went over and above the call of duty. They were sinners exceedingly. And Lot moved in next door to them. He sort of cozied up. Now, he didn't, it's very obvious when you go through and you read the account, Lot didn't do everything they did. But Lot got pretty close to them. And Abram must have been sort of discouraged about that time. Here's Lot. He's brought him all the way down here to the Promised Land, and he's sort of built it up in his mind as to how all this was going to work out and the promises God had made. And what does he find? Lot chooses a place for himself over across the river from the Promised Land. Lot has his own way that he thinks he's going to work things out. And so God must have noticed that he was sort of discouraged, and he said in verse 14, he said to Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, he says, lift up now your eyes and look from the place where you are. Look north and south and east and west. For all the land which you see, to you will I give it, and to your seed forever. And I'll make your seed as the dust of the earth. If a man can number the dust, he can number your seed. Arise and walk through the length and the breadth of the land. Then Abram did it. So here God encourages him. He said, look, don't be discouraged. I'm going to give this land to you and your descendants. Don't be discouraged by the fact that Lot's crossed the river and moved in next door to Sodom. I'm going to give this land to you and to your seed. Well, as we come on through the story in chapter 14, Lot found himself in trouble. Now, a lot of times people get in trouble not because they have started out with the intent of getting in trouble. They got in trouble because they pursued a way that seemed right to them. And some people not only get in trouble, but then after they get in trouble, they don't take a hint to address the root of their trouble. Now, Lot, we're going to see, maybe drew a wrong conclusion from some of his troubles. As we are introduced to the story in chapter 14, we have the account that there had been this confederation of kings that had stretched from the land of Shinar, the land of Babylon, up across the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris, Euphrates, across through the area of the Elamites, on into what is today Asia, today Turkey, ancient Asia Minor, the Hittite Empire. This confederation of kings had joined together and were going to conquer the Middle East and Egypt. They had already come down through this central swath, had put the Canaanite cities under tribute, including the cities of the Jordan Plain, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and others, put them under tribute. And a little time went by, and some of these cities got the idea they weren't going to pay tribute anymore. So then this confederation of kings comes down to smash them, make an example out of them. And when they did, they conquered Sodom and Gomorrah, took all the people captive, looted the city, and headed on back. Word came to Abram that his nephew and his nephew's family and all of his property had been included in this raid. So when Abram heard that, in verse 14 of Genesis 14, he armed his trained servants born in his own house. There were 318 of them, and they pursued up north to the area later known as Dan. And he, with God's help, was able to absolutely smite these invading armies, and he brought back everything that had been taken captive, including Lot and all the people with him. And he came back, and he reached the environs of Jerusalem, known as Salem, and was met by Melchizedek, here in Genesis 14, verse 18. Now, Paul explains in Hebrews 7 that Melchizedek was certainly no ordinary man. He was not a human being. He was rather the one that we know as Jesus Christ, the God of the Old Testament who manifested himself here in human form. Paul tells us in Hebrews 7, speaking of Melchizedek, that he was without father, without mother, without beginning of days or end of life, that he abides a priest continually. Now that sort of narrows down the field. You don't have a father, you don't have a mother, you don't have a beginning of life or an end of days. I can't think of anybody that meets that criteria, in terms of just an ordinary human being. No, he abides a priest continually. He's Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness, and he's king of Salem also, which means king of peace. Paul brings that out and explains it in Hebrews 7. So we hear Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God, the one who later came in human flesh. This was simply manifesting himself as he did to Abraham later in Genesis 18 and other places. And Abram tithed to Melchizedek. He was the recipient of God's tithes, and he blessed Abram. And the king of Sodom offered to divide up the goods, and Abram said no. He said, I don't want to take so much as one shoelace from you. Here's your stuff back. So, in chapter 15, this was sort of an unsettling thing. Here an invasion had come through. People had been taken off. Abram had gone down there, and God had delivered the whole army into his hands. And the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, Fear not, Abram. I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward. Don't worry about having given up these things. I'm your reward. I'm your shield. I'm your protector. You don't have to worry. Because, maybe various things were said about, well, look, boy, this shows how vulnerable we are living out here in the open, and here these people come in and these invaders. God told Abram, he said, I'm your shield and I'm your reward. Now, in the meantime, see, years have gone by this time, and several years, and Abram is undoubtedly, he's thought about it. Well, now, how is God going to bless me? Because I thought it was going to be through my nephew Lot, but see, Lot didn't come back now to dwell in the promised land. He went back to Sodom. We're going to pick up the story. Lot didn't learn anything from being taken off into that captivity. He went back. In fact, what we find as we study the story carefully, originally Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. Afterward, he moved in. He folded up his tent and moved in a house inside of Sodom. See, Lot had not learned the lesson of where security comes from. It's like, boy, I'm a little scared to live out here in a tent while all, these marauding armies come through. I think I'll just move into town. Well, it was town that got taken captive. If the walls of Sodom were going to protect you, why didn't they protect all the ones that were there? Lot didn't get the point on that. He moved in. We're going to see that in a minute. But Abraham must have certainly had in mind, sort of wondered, how's God going to work this out? And so he brings it up to God in chapter 15, verse 2. Abram said unto the eternal God, well, you're talking about all these promises and what you're going to give me, but how are you going to do that since I go childless? Years have gone by. I don't have any children. Now, the steward, I've got a suggestion, God. The steward of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. He is my most trusted servant. He was born in my household. Now, it's customary, as it was in that area, for sometimes if someone had no heirs, that the steward, their most trusted servant, would be their heir. So Abram said in chapter 15, verse 3, you've given me no seed. One born in my house is my heir. And the word said, if I die, the only heir I have is not even somebody who's a blood relative. He's a servant who was born in my house. And the word of the Lord came unto him and said, he shall not be your heir. No, that's not the way it's going to work. But he that shall come forth out of your own bowels shall be your heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and he said, look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, and if you're able to number them, then that's how your seed will be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Abram believed God, and God counted that for righteousness. Now, I can tell you what, I hadn't tried it here in downtown Memphis, but I suspect it's about the same as in downtown Baton Rouge. Back several weeks ago, I after Friday night supper, my wife and I and one of the boys were going to come out and take a little walk there in the neighborhood after supper. And I came out and looked up, and as we looked up, could see, star over here and star over there. And I looked at my wife and I said, it's a good thing Abraham didn't live in Baton Rouge. If he had and God made him a promise like this, look up and see the stars, and that's the number of your descendants, he'd have looked up and he'd have concluded that he may finally get up to 15 or 20, descendants, great grandkids or something. That wouldn't have been a real optimistic promise. Well, when he looked up at the stars, it was like when you're out in the country and there's no lights around and you look up and it's just, there's so many you can just almost reach out and touch them. And so this is what he saw. And God said, don't worry. You don't have to worry about Eliezer being your heir. I'm going to bless you with an heir who's going to come forth out of your body. So he made Abraham a promise. Gave him a little taste of the future in terms of through a dream. Now as we come on down, chapter 16, a few more years go by. Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. So God made him a promise, and now more time went by, and he still didn't have anything to show for it. And Sarah began to do a little thinking. She had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And she said, the Lord has restrained me from bearing. Now what you need to do is go in and obtain children by her. And Abram listened to what she said. And so we find that he took her. Now he had lived there 10 years in the land of Canaan, verse 3. And they'd had no children, so he went into Hagar and she conceived. Well, sure enough, just shortly after she was pregnant, there began to be trouble between her and Sarah. And Sarah decided this wasn't such a good idea. And she began to get jealous, and she was upset. And then she began to fuss at Abraham about it. And Abram said in verse 6, look, and he was a man who knew when to keep his mouth shut. And he said, look, this day, you do anything you want to with her. Count me out. I don't even have a suggestion. I'm just going to, you just do this any way you want it. You just any way you want. So he decided that the smart thing for him to do, he'd already dug himself in a little too deep, and the smart thing for him to do was to just sort of back out. Well, Sarah was mad, and she was frustrated and upset, so she was just going to chase Hagar away. And you go on through chapter 16, the angel of God brought Hagar back. Now, Abraham, verse 16, was 86 when Ishmael was born. Now, chapter 17, verse 1, we come on 13 years into the future. He's 99. The Lord appeared to Abram, and he said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk you before me, and be you perfect. Be completely wholehearted and sincere, and I'll make my covenant. And Abram fell on his face. And God said, verse 4, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. Your name is not Abram anymore, it's Abraham. I'm going to make you exceeding fruitful, and all your descendants are to be circumcised. Now, Abram thought that God told him that this was to be the case, because the Ishmael was not going to be his heir. That was not God's God's plan or God's purpose. That in fact, down in verse 17 and 18, you see, Abraham just started laughing. I mean, here he is now. He's waited. 24 years have gone by since God made him this promise, and he left and came to the promised land. And for 24 years he's been waiting, and every so often he get discouraged, and God come back and reiterate the promise. Now he's 99, and the Lord said, now, I tell you what, we're going to bless you, and you're going to have, I'm going to multiply your descendants. And Abram said, verse 18, oh, my Lord, let Ishmael live before you. Look, let's quit while we're ahead. I've got one, it took me 86 years to have him, and 13 more have gone by, and I appreciate the thought, but I think maybe we better quit while we're ahead. And God said no. No, this one doesn't count. You're going to have a child by Sarah. Now, and not only that, now get this. He says, your name isn't Abram anymore, it's Abraham. It's father of a multitude. So now Abraham gets to walk out, and he gets to call everybody together and say, folks, I have an announcement to make to you. From now on, I'm to be known as father of a multitude. And people are going to look and they're going to think, this guy's 99, he's got one little illegitimate kid running around, and he's going to be called father of a multitude. Well, that's what God said. And you know what? Abraham believed him. He thought it was pretty funny. And Sarah thought it was pretty funny too, so God said, fine, we'll name him Laugh. And that's what Isaac means in Hebrew. It means laugh. Because they thought it was pretty funny. And sure enough, God provided the heir. Now, Abraham kept coming up with his scenarios. Maybe it'll be through Lot. Maybe it'll be through my servant Eliezer. Maybe it'll be, I'll sort of work things out. It will be my child, but not Sarah's. It'll be Ishmael. He kept coming up with good ideas, but they weren't God's ideas. You know, one of the things you and I always have to learn as we go through life, God means what He says and He'll do what He says, but He'll do it His way. And the fact that you and I can't figure out, well, how can God do this? How can God work? The fact that I can't figure out how He does it, how He's going to do it, all that proves is He's a lot smarter than I am. The fact that we can't figure it out just shows how much we don't know. We look at something and say, I don't see how God's going to get from here to here. All right? I don't need to see how He's going to do it. All I need to do is believe that He will. If He said He will, He will. And as we see the story here in chapter 18, the Lord and two angels come here to Abraham. And you remember the story, before they leave, they tell him and say, we're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham begins to plead and to, in a sense, to try to solicit God's favor that He will spare Sodom and Gomorrah, even if there are only 10 righteous people. Because you see, Abraham is concerned about Lot. He's very deeply concerned about Lot. The story of Abraham and Lot has taken a divergence. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan as a stranger and as a pilgrim. He lived in the land of Canaan, never being part of that society. He understood the importance of retaining his identity as an heir, as a foreigner. Lot, on the other hand, well, notice in chapter 19 and verse 1, the two angels came to Sodom that evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. Now, Lot originally pitched his tent toward Sodom. Now, he's moved in, and he's a part of the hierarchy. He's one of the elders of the city. He has a seat right there in the gate where business is transacted and legal matters are transacted. Now, perhaps Lot thought that if he'd sort of get involved in politics a little bit, he could be a good influence on the Sodomites, sort of help reform them a little bit and make Sodom a better place. I don't know if he started picking up trash by the roadside or what he did, but he was going to try to improve Sodom, make it a little better place. The trouble was, then instead of Lot improving Sodom, Sodom dragged Lot down. Because Lot became too entangled. The worst thing that happened was the toll that it took on his family. It's not that Lot did everything the Sodomites did. He didn't. That's apparent. You know, back in the New Testament, Peter refers to him as just Lot. But when you read the account in Genesis chapter 19, it's very apparent that he was just barely just Lot. Just barely. In fact, his family didn't make it. You come on down the story, and the angels tell him after a little while that they're going to destroy the place. Verse 13. They're going to destroy the place because the cry has waxed great. Verse 14, Lot went out, and he spoke to his sons-in-law, which married his daughters. And he said, up, get you out of this place. The Lord's going to destroy the city. And he seemed as one that mocked to them. They laughed at him. They said, you old crackpot. You and that crazy religion of yours. What do you mean God's going to destroy it? Get out of here. When the morning arose, the angels hastened Lot and said, arise, take your wife and your two daughters which are here, lest you be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold on his hand and upon the hand of his wife, the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful. And they brought him forth and set him outside the city. Lot lingered. He didn't want to leave. You know why he didn't want to leave? Because he knew the destruction that was going to come on the city, and he knew what was going to happen to his family left behind. Lot had allowed himself to become so entangled and intertwined in Sodom. His children had married there in Sodom. Now, you know, Abraham took a little different approach. You find he sent his most trusted servant all the way back to Ur of the Chaldees to obtain an appropriate wife for his son. But Lot lost sight of the fact that he was a foreigner and a sojourner. He took out citizenship, as it were. He became a part of the society, not necessarily doing all the things they were doing. He didn't get as bad as the society around him, but his whole condition deteriorated, and it rubbed off on his family to where they were absorbed in that society and in that culture, and ultimately they perished in the flames of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot made a very tragic mistake. A tragic mistake that he had to suffer the consequences of. You see, Lot, instead of choosing to follow the pathway that Abraham had, instead of choosing a part of the promised land, instead of looking to God as his source of security, instead of maintaining carefully his identity. And I'll tell you, when it gets to where you can't tell where the church starts and the world, or where the world stops and the church starts, you got trouble. And that is something that has beset the people of God from Genesis to Revelation. From the beginning until on out till the time that Satan is put away. The devil has two different ways of getting at the people of God. One is to attack from without, and the other is to incite decay from within. And you go through the Bible, you go through book after book, you go through example after example, and you find that those twin problems have always beset the people of God. There have been attacks and persecution and onslaught from without, attempting to discourage and to destroy the people of God. And then there have been the insidious workings to spread corruption and decay, to entice the people of God into letting down their guard and beginning to lose their identity by blending with the world around them. That's a danger. And you just go through and pick out a book. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. You just go through and pick out a book and start reading it and see if that's not the story that you see over and over. Why should it have come as any surprise that there are problems on down in our day? We're not unique, and the situations we face are not unique. Lot lost sight. But he was a stranger. He was a pilgrim. Lot became part of that society. Lot almost gave up his identity. He managed to hold on to it at the last minute, but with a terrible price. Because his children really never established that identity. They derived their identity from Sodom around. Brethren, this world in which we live, we look out here and things look so permanent and so steady and so stable. We look at the buildings and we look at the streets and the freeways and the big concrete buildings. And I'm here to tell you, time is coming when this is going to come crashing down. This world is not going to abide. It's not going to endure. It's based on a false foundation. John writes in 1 John that all that is in the world, 1 John chapter 2, all that is in the world, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but it's of the world. The world passes away, and he that fulfills the lust thereof. The way to endure is not to jettison our identity, not to lose sight of who we are and why we are, but to recognize the need we have as God's people to be what God would have us be. Abraham did not lose sight of his identity as a stranger, as a pilgrim. Now, there's a very interesting account of Abraham's grandson. It's recorded a little later in the book of Genesis. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. You remember the story. Jacob and Esau were the twin sons of Isaac. And Jacob was, he was a real wheeler-dealer. I mean, he was maneuvering and sort of wheeling and dealing every which way. And he finally got himself in a real jam. He was always trying to get one up on somebody, and he had beat his brother on a couple of things. And the last time around, he really made old Esau mad. And Esau was not the kind of fellow you wanted to get riled up. And Esau said, "I'm going to kill you." And you know what? Jake looked around and he says, "I think he means it this time. I think he means it." And he was pretty scared, and his mother and dad said, "Look, you need to get out of here. You go back to where your mother's people are, and you go back and stay back there. Besides, I don't want you marrying one of the Canaanites. Don't want you marry. You're not supposed to be marrying that way anyway. So you need to go back there." So he went back, Genesis chapter 28, and we find that he went as far as he could in verse 11. About sunset, he came there to a place, and he spent the night, and he had a dream. And in that dream, he saw a stairway reaching up to heaven, and he saw angels descending and ascending, and he saw, in his dream, he saw the Eternal standing above at the top of the stairway, saying, "I am the eternal God of Abraham and Isaac, and I'm going to give you the land whereon you lie, and your seed will spread abroad." Well, when Jacob woke up the next morning, this just scared him to death. I mean, he had this vivid dream of God speaking to him, and he was afraid, verse 17, and decided to call this place the house of God, Bethel. In verse 18, he rose up early in the morning, took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and he set it for a pillar, poured oil upon it, named it Bethel. In verse 20, he vowed a vow. Now, Jacob loved to try to cut a deal, and here he was in a hurry, and he was going to cut a deal with God. He said, "If God will be with me and keep me in the way that I go, and give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this pillar shall be God's house, and then I'm going to start tithing." He said, "Lord, I'm in a hurry. I'd really like to take time to stop and worship you and do some stuff, but I'm in a hurry. Old Esau's going to kill me if he catches me, and he's on the way. So I've got to hurry. But I'll tell you what, I've got a real deal for you. If you'll take care of me and get me back home safely, once I come back, I'm really going to get out of business. I'm going to worship you. You're going to be my God. I'm going to start tithing. I'm going to do all this stuff. But I'm just in a little bit of a hurry right now. And I'd sure appreciate it if you just sort of take care of me and get me back here safely. And if you do, once I get back, all this stuff is behind me, you're going to see, boy, I'm really going to buckle down. I'm going to start doing all this stuff." Sometimes people make deals, or at least try to God. Jacob had a little bit of what we would call foxhole religion. He was scared, he was in a jam, and he started making promises to God. So then he went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. He got on over there, and he met up with his mother's brother, his uncle, Laban. Now, I don't know if Laban sold used camels or not, but if he didn't, he missed a golden opportunity, because he was really the sort of fellow that you would expect to see doing something like that. When God wants sometimes to teach us a lesson, he lets us fall into the hands of somebody just like we are, only a little more so. And then we all of a sudden we're on the receiving end of the same sort of stuff we've been dishing out. And it's amazing the lessons we learn when we get on the other end. Jacob fell in love with Laban's daughter, Rachel, and he wanted to marry her. And Laban said, well, that's pretty good. You know, you're a good boy, and you're my nephew and all, and I'd be delighted for you to marry my daughter. But you know, you're flat broke. You don't have a dower. You don't have, you know what you need? I'll let you have her, but you need to work for me 7 years. Jacob agreed. He worked for him 7 years. The end of the 7 years, you know the story. The next morning, that wasn't Rachel, that was Leah. And boy, Jacob came hunting for Laban, and he was mad. And Laban said, oh, I thought you knew. Oh, in our country, we have a custom. The oldest one has to get married first. I thought you knew that. Well, you want to marry Rachel, we'll tell you what, another 7 years, and she's yours. Well, as you go on through the story, you know, they finish this up, and Laban, or Jacob didn't have any, Jacob had 2 wives and a bunch of kids, and he didn't have any way to support them into all this years. And Laban said in chapter 20, in chapter 30, verse 28, told him, well, you tell me what you want, you know, give me what you'd like for wages, and I'll pay you. I'll hire you. Well, as we come on a little further, chapter 31, verse 41, Jacob said, I've been 20 years in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, 6 years for your cattle, and you've changed my wages 10 times. 10 times. Every time he appointed him wages, all right, and every time Jacob started making a little money, Laban would go back and refigure the contract. You ever worked for somebody like that? Every time you started getting ahead, they started trying to see if there wasn't a way that they could keep you a little further behind. So here, 20 years have gone by, and old Laban is just, you know, he's rooked him going and coming. And Jacob has finally gotten himself in such a mess that if God didn't help him to get him out of it, he'd never have gotten out. In fact, that's what he said in verse 42. He said, the God of my father, God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, had been with me, you would send me away right now empty. You'd send me away without a dime if you could, Laban. I know you. Been working for you 20 years. I've sort of gotten the picture by now. You know, after 20 years, you can sort of figure out the way a person is. So, they separated. Jacob came on back. God had told him to go back to the land. And Jacob went on his way in chapter 32. And chapter 32, verse 1. And we find in verse 3 that he sent messengers on to Esau, his brother. And he sent them with a real nice message and sounding pretty humble, a little different than the way he had sounded 20 years earlier. And verse 6, the messengers returned to Jacob. And they said, we met your brother. We came to him. And he said he was going to come to meet you. And he's got 400 men with him. And Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He thought, oh me, all these years have gone by and old Esau hadn't forgotten a thing. Now he's going to come to meet me, and he's got a whole bunch of guys with him. And you can read a little bit about Esau, and you can figure these must have been a rough bunch that he had riding with him. And notice a little difference in Jacob's attitude. You remember earlier when he was getting ready to flee from Esau and he was cutting deals with God? Well, look, God, you'll do this. I tell you what, you take care of all this. And when I get back, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. He's going to make a deal. Notice what he said in verse 9. He said, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, the Lord which said unto me, return unto your country, unto your kindred, and I'll deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all your mercies, and of all the truth which you showed unto your servant. You know, I just passed over the Jordan with my staff, and that's all. And now I've come back, and I've got all of this. Deliver me, I pray you, from the hand of my brother, lest he come and smite me, and destroy my whole family. Jacob displays a different attitude. He says, you know, I know that I don't deserve any good thing. He asked God's mercy. And so, sure enough, you find that later that evening, he moved the family on, and an angel confronted him, and he wrestled all night, as it describes in verse 24. You want God's blessing? Hold on. You want God's blessing? You've got to hold on and wrestle. That was the message. Jacob, are you willing to persevere? Are you willing to endure? And he did. And God took care of him, and Esau came, and for some amazing reason, Esau was in a good attitude and was glad to see him, and they embraced, and then they went their way. And Jacob, we're told, down in verse 17 of chapter 33, journeyed to Succoth, and he built a house, and he made booths for his cattle, and he named this place Succoth, and he bought a parcel of land, and he sort of settled in. Now Jacob began to get a little too comfortable here in the land. He began to sort of let down his guard. And he allowed his daughter to start running around with the Canaanite girls. And it wasn't long before she got tangled up in fornication with one of these Canaanite boys, this Hivite prince. And he wanted to marry her, and he got his father to come to Jacob and ask. And then they had a mess. And this was Jacob didn't quite know what to do. He was afraid of antagonizing the whole bunch, and he knew this wasn't a right marriage, and he was upset and didn't quite know what to do. Well, his sons found out, and they knew what to do, at least they thought they did. In a carnal way, they knew what they were going to do. So they decided to use a little trickery. Chapter 34, and they very upset. So they called Hamor and Shechem, and they said, look, you want to marry, you want our sister. And Dad wouldn't give you a straight answer. Well, I'll tell you what the real deal is. The real thing is that you fellas aren't circumcised. That's why Dad's sort of dragging his feet. If y'all all get circumcised, why, it'll be okay. And Hamor said, well, that's okay. We'll just all marry and intermarry and everything. And so he comes back and tells everybody in town that they're all going to have to get circumcised. But says when we do, well, we'll all be just one family, and these people are peaceable, verse 21, and we'll just marry their women, and pretty soon all their property will be ours. We just need to get circumcised. So, verse 24, they all became circumcised. Verse 25, the third day, when they were sore. The two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, they took each man his sword, came into the city boldly, and slew all the males. Just wiped out the whole bunch. And took everything captive. And Jacob said in verse 30 to Simeon and Levi, you fellows have really got trouble going now. You've troubled me and made me to stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites. And there's so many of them, they're going to gather together and kill all of us. Well, they weren't particularly repentant. They felt like they were justified by the way their sister had been treated. Jacob was in a mess. And God said unto Jacob, he said, I think it's about time for you to arise and go to Bethel. I think it's about time for you to arise and go to Bethel because, you made an agreement with me many years earlier. You made an agreement, and you haven't been back. A lot has transpired. And Jacob understood that to arise and go back to Bethel to renew his relationship with God meant that he needed to do some things. And he called his household and he said, put away the strange gods and be clean and change your garments. Let us arise and go to Bethel, and I'll make there an altar to God who was with me in the day of my distress. And they gave unto Jacob the strange gods that were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the oak that was by Shechem. Now here were his sons. See, they'd sort of blended in with the society around you. You can go back to Judges 8 and other places and find that the men wearing earrings was something that the Ishmaelites were noted for. It was not something that was customarily done by Israel. But Jacob, you see, had allowed things to deteriorate. Now he said, we've got to get things straightened out. We've got to arise and go back to Bethel to renew a relationship with God. And if we're going to do that, then we need to get rid of all this that we have accumulated. You see, his identity as a foreigner was being lost. He was blending in with the society. He was losing sight that he was a foreigner, a pilgrim. He had, for all of his good intentions, he had cozied up a little too close to the world around, and he was paying a consequence in his family. And he woke up to it. And he said, we've got to clean up our act. We've got to change. We're going to dig a hole under this tree. We're going to bury all this junk we've accumulated, and we're going to go forward. We're going to arise and go back to Bethel and renew our vows to God. And he did. We're called to be strangers, to be pilgrims. We're called to be in the world, but not of the world. We're called to be ambassadors for Christ, to reflect the way of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. We're called to hold forth the word of life in a world of darkness. We're called as ambassadors for Christ, advance emissaries of a kingdom, of a government that is going to be established. We're called to be ambassadors for Christ, to retain our ambassadorship. We have to remember that our citizenship is in heaven. Our citizenship, we're not part and parcel of this world. We're strangers, we're pilgrims, we're temporary dwellers. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20. Our citizenship is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, he didn't say we live in heaven. He didn't say we're going to heaven. Our citizenship. You see, in the ancient world, citizenship was derived from the city of origin. Our city is not Jerusalem below. It's not Babylon. Our city is Jerusalem above. Our identity is derived from the fact that we are sons of God, children of God, to be born into his family at the resurrection. We're ambassadors for Christ. Our citizenship resides in the New Jerusalem. We're going to dwell in that eternal city when it comes down to the earth. Because you see, we read of that. Let's notice, we see our citizenship is to be in heaven in Revelation 3:12. Revelation 3:12. Him that overcomes, Christ said, will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. And I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name. We're going to have the name of the city of our God. What is the city of our God? It is the New Jerusalem. Our citizenship is in heaven. But the New Jerusalem is going to come down from God out of heaven to the earth. Now, the word citizenship is in the Greek language, back in Philippians 3:20, it's the word politeia. It's derived from polis, which means city. Right here in verse 12, when it talks about the city of my God, the polis of my God, the New Jerusalem, the place from whence citizenship is derived. It's the New Jerusalem. See, we're told of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob back in Hebrews 11. We read just a few moments ago, that they died in faith, not having received the promises. Well, let's notice in verse 8, Hebrews 11, Abraham, when he was called to go out to a place that he would after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing where he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, a foreign country. He dwelt in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob. For he looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He looked for a city that has foundations, the place from which his citizenship sprang. He didn't come into the land of Canaan as a citizen. He was a stranger, a foreigner. He retained that foreignness. He did not lose his identity. He did not derive his identity from the Canaanite society in which he dwelt. God told Israel when he brought them out of Egypt that they were not to do according to the customs of Egypt from whence they had come, nor were they to do according to the customs of Canaan where they were going to be. That they were to follow his laws. They were to practice his ways. We have to be on guard, brethren, because we live in a world that will erode away the boundaries of who we are, why we are, what we are. We live in a society that will erode away those boundaries and will seek to make us a part of this world. Abraham looked for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. He and the others were strangers and pilgrims. We can look at their lessons and examples and realize some were more successful in retaining that identity than others. We must be ever vigilant and ever on guard. As Paul explains in Philippians 2:12, wherefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear, trembling. For it is God which works in you, both to will and to do of his own good pleasure. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. We've been called to be a light to this world. We do that by retaining our status as a foreigner, a sojourner. We're strangers and pilgrims in the earth. We look for a city that has foundations, the city where our citizenship resides. We are in the world, but not of the world, because our loyalty, our allegiance, and our devotion is set on those things, the foundations of a society that will endure forever, the kingdom of God.